Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It's a big excitement to be here. So I'm going to tell you about some work that I've been doing for the last couple of years, trying to rethink software design, trying to answer the question, what is really the essence of software design? And behind this question, I have to admit, there's a little bit of a true confession, which is that I've been working in the area of formal methods for a long time. I think somewhat as an iconoclast, but I've come to the conclusion that I haven't been nearly iconoclastic enough. And so I'm trying to rethink all the assumptions that I've been making about what software design is really all about. So let me start with a slanted answer to the question, what is software design? So let's start by considering design in a more traditional realm, namely buildings. This beautiful thing, which looks like a building that's tumbling down, it's actually the building I work in, and my office looks out on this wonderful view. Is an example of design in the architectural realm, not the software architectural realm. So in this particular realm, we could ask the question, what is the difference between a designer, namely an architect who works on a building like this, and an engineer? And here's how I think about it. So we can divide the aspects of design and engineering into two parts. The elements that they're concerned with, the pieces they use to think about what they're building, and the goals or concerns that they bring to their evaluation of what they're doing. So the engineer is concerned with the interior structure of the building, the columns, the beams, the trusses, and so on. And the criteria of the engineer are ensure that the building doesn't fall down. The structural integrity of the building, but also how it behaves over the long term, its sustainability and its durability and so on. The designer, on the other hand, is concerned with the things that the user experiences, the doors, the windows, the floors, and so on, and the experience that they provide. And the goals of the designer are to produce a building that is comfortable and convenient and attractive and so on. In other words, the designer sits at the interface between the concerns of the construction and the concerns of the user. The designer has to ensure that the user is happy with the outcome. So let's move to software. So what's the equivalent kind of distinction for a piece of software? So I would argue that for an engineer, the elements are the things we build programs out of, functions, closures, objects, types, modules, and so on. And there's been an enormous amount of work on what this collection of things looks like. And obviously, the concerns of the engineer are that this system should be maintainable, it should be correct, and it should be fast. The designer, on the other hand, is concerned primarily with the things directly experienced by the user. Now, of course, the user also is concerned that the system be fast and correct, but primarily the user wants the system to be usable, wants the functions to actually fulfill the user's purpose. And there's been, of course, a lot of discussion in the usability community about what those goals should be. And one of the common breakdowns, which I rather like, is to identify three goals. The first is that the system should be learnable, meaning that when you sit down in front of it, you can figure out what to do with it. Secondly, that it should be effective, that when you've eventually figured it out, you should be able to use it to fulfill your task, and ideally to do that efficiently. And thirdly, it should be tolerant to errors made by the user. So if you make the simplest kind of error, it doesn't let off a nuclear warhead or whatever. And the question I would pose is, what are the elements of design that the designer is trying to build in software that correspond to these things? And I'll tell you one thing which I don't think is an answer. It's not user interface widgets, because as we all know, those are just the surface phenomena, right? Those aren't the essence of what the designer's coming up with. Those don't ultimately determine whether or not the system is learnable and effective and so on. Now, another question we can ask is, what are the criteria by which we determine whether or not these elements actually fulfill the goals we have in mind? So let's look at, again, at software. So in the domain of the engineer, how do we know whether or not the functions and objects and types and so on we have are actually going to result in a program that is maintainable and correct and so on, right? Well, I would argue that there are two things, basically, we've come up with. And those are decoupling and localization. They're subtly related. Amazingly, they were both essentially ideas invented by David Parnas, although arguably many other people contributed to these ideas. But essentially, when I teach programming, I'm always have in mind that this is what it comes down to. There are really only two ideas in programming, decoupling and localization. That's it. And once you understand those two, everything else is just a detail. And all the complicated things we do, from dependency injection to representation independence, abstract data types, callbacks, all this kind of thing, these are just mechanisms to achieve decoupling and localization. So the question we could ask is, well, what are the criteria going to be on the design side that will correspond to those kind of criteria on the code side? And that's really what my work is trying to address. And that's what this talk is about. So before I plunge into this, I should warn you, to put you in the right frame of mind, that this talk is full of obsessive details. And I'd like to justify that, because I actually think that this is the only way you can make progress in this area. And in fact, if you look in the domain of traditional design, it's also quite common for people to recognize that details are really what it's all about. There's a lovely video that you can watch online where Joni Ive talks about his design work, and he particularly talks about fashioning the curved corners of the MacBook. And at the end of the interview, when he's been talking about all these incredible details with enormous passion, he smiles and says, "Riley, that's pretty obsessive, isn't it?" Because he realizes he's been talking about all these things which might seem really crazy to someone who really is just interested in having something that looks nice and works well. But the truth is, in order to achieve that level of design, it's necessary to invest a huge amount of effort in these tiny little details. And as the great designer Charles Eames said, the details are not just the details, they make the design. So let me give you just one tiny example that we came across where I think that the details of a design can have quite a significant impact on what the users experience. So here's a delightful little question I saw come up in Quora a year or two ago. Someone accidentally deleted thousands of files in my company Dropbox. How can I quickly undelete them? Now, I love this question, right? This was clearly not written by a computer scientist or a software engineer, because no computer scientist would have such optimism. Not only to imagine that you could undelete them, right? But that you could do it quickly? Like, what planet are they on, right? They should be saying, you know, I'll do anything, right? I'll pay $1 million. I'll sacrifice my firstborn son. I'll wait 3 weeks. How can I get them back, right? But instead, this person thinks, like, I want it quickly. Like, come on, you know. We know this is dreaming. But the point is that if you look around the web, you will find that this Dropbox I deleted everything experience is actually quite common. And there are a lot of complaints about this. And one wonders, how does this happen, that people do such terrible things to each other on Dropbox? And I don't think it's malice. I actually suspect that there are a couple of conceptual flaws in the design of Dropbox that encourage accidental deletion. And one of them is that there are actually two subtly different kinds of deletion. There's deletion of a top-level share. So I share a folder with you, and you choose to delete it. And there's a deletion of a folder, for example, within that share. And these two deletions, although they both are called delete, and they both use the same button, behave completely differently. I should also say, they get the same message from Dropbox, which is, do you really want to delete X? But in the former case of deleting the share, you simply leave it. Right? The share is no longer shared, and it goes, you know, you no longer have access to it. Nothing happens from the owner's point of view. In the second case, you will actually delete the owner's copy of all those files. So we actually did a little experiment to find out if we were the only people who were confused by this. I had an undergraduate, Kelly Zhang, and she surveyed a whole load of her friends. So she got 50 or 60 MIT undergraduates, and she gave them a very simple questionnaire to see if they understood this behavior of Dropbox. And she also asked them to classify themselves according to whether they had good, average, or poor knowledge of Dropbox. And you can see how well they did on the answers to these two questions. Even the people with claimed good knowledge of Dropbox got only a little over 50%, got the answer right only a little bit over 50% of the time. People who had poor knowledge didn't have a clue what deleting a shared folder did, and people with average knowledge got it wrong less than 40% of the time. So this could be a sign of trouble. So bear this in mind as I show you all these nitpicky little details, because I would like to contend that these little nitpicky details are at the heart of what makes software usable and pleasant. So here are 3 sample problems that I want to sort of introduce the flavor of what I'd like to address. The first problem, email categories. So as all of you who use Gmail know, Gmail a few years ago introduced this notion of categories, this concept of categories, in which your inbox can be classified into the primary messages, the social messages, promotional messages, and so on. And there's a nice feature that allows you to customize the appearance of your inbox by assigning tabs to these different categories. So you might think, well, this is cool. And not only do you have this nice customized appearance, but Google does this automatic analysis for you to determine which emails should fit into which categories. When this came out, however, the blogosphere was not happy. This feature was described as super confusing. And here's what another blogger said. This is really ugly, stupid, and unnecessary. Here's another favorable review. Google gets it terribly, terribly wrong. Sorry, George. It's quickly apparent that this new feature is a disaster. So what was going on here? I think what was going on here was that people were actually already pretty happy with Gmail. They had a concept that was called labels that were used to organize messages. And they had things called smart labels, where the labels were assigned automatically to incoming messages. So nobody understood why it was necessary to have an entirely new concept unrelated to labels. Now, you might wonder then, what is the difference between a category and a label? Well, I had that question, and as I was preparing this talk, I looked up on the Google help facility what a label is, and here's what it says. Labels help you organize your messages into categories. So sometimes confusion about concepts exists within the developer organization too. Now, I should say, I don't believe this is just an aesthetic nitpick. For all these examples I'm going to show you, they result in really not being able to do something. So what is it that you can't do in this case? Well, in this case, you cannot associate tabs with labels. This feature of organizing your inbox into tabs is only available for categories. And furthermore, you can't use these tabs outside the inbox. So it is a rather limited feature, and it's not clear why it's like this. Second problem, camera settings. So I have this lovely camera. It's a Fuji X100. It's a kind of attempt at a Leica killer, incredibly popular camera. And it has this very nice feature, which is that in addition to being able to set the image quality, where you can choose, for example, whether or not you just want a raw image, or whether you also want to switch to fine plus raw, which means that you want to store a computed JPEG in addition to the raw image. You can also adjust the aspect ratio. So here's my lovely daughter. I'm looking through the viewfinder at her. And suppose I want to take square pictures. I want to be cool and take Instagram-like things with this camera. Well, the way I do that is that I simply go to this image size menu, and then I can switch the ratio, you can see, from 3:2 at the top to 1:1. And now I get square images. Okay? And now everything you would think looks pretty happy. However, you might ask the question, what if I go back to the image quality menu and I turn off the JPEGs, right, so that I'm only recording the raw image? Well, if I do that, this is what happens. The image size menu magically now says raw and is grayed out, as if to say, up yours. No aspect ratio for you anymore. So again, actually even more demonstrably here, there's something fundamental you can't do. You cannot have a non-standard aspect ratio and only store raw images, which is actually what I always want to do. And now you might think, well, there's a good reason for this, right? The reason is that this aspect ratio is just a crop, and they're simply computing this crop from the raw and putting it on the JPEG. That's actually not true. So the people who actually implemented this aspect ratio thing did a really nice job. And if you open one of these images, the raw image in Lightroom or Photoshop, for example, you'll see something like this. I'm not sure you can see this on this screen, but this is the 3:2 image, and then it's grayed out on the sides where the crop is. So the crop is actually stored non-destructively. So in the internal engine, they did exactly the right thing, but that functionality is not accessible. Here's a third example, fonts and styles. This is from Adobe InDesign, which is essentially the industry standard tool for desktop publishing. And I've opened the character style dialog box, which allows me to set a uniform style. For example, if I want to have an emphasis style that I'll use to make sure that whenever I want to emphasize something, I'll put it in italics. And what's very important here is that if you look at this box, the font is not specified. And that's useful, right? Because that allows me to say, maybe I'll change the font later, or maybe I had different parts of the document in different fonts, but I always want emphasis to be italics. Okay? So that seems like a reasonable thing to ask for, and that's exactly what this feature is designed for. However, it doesn't actually work in quite the way you might expect. You see this pop-up marked font style? What do you think I will see if I click on that? What other options will I have in addition to italic? What do you think? bold, underlined. Well, that's what you'd hope. Here's what you see, right? And why do you see that? Because italic is actually just a font variant. And if, like me, you love fonts and you have a big collection of them, right, then you've got all these, all these open type and professional fonts that have a lot of intricate variants, right? So what does that mean? It means that you cannot actually define a style that uniformly italicizes typefaces. And the reason for that is that if, for example, I want to italicize Arno, I need to know that it's called Arno italic. If I want to italicize Futura, I need to know that it's called Futura oblique. And if I want to italicize Magma light, I need to know that it's Magma light italic. And if my font is set to Magma, I will need light italic as the setting in that dialog box to get the appropriate italicization. So what kinds of problems are all of these? Well, I would argue they're not minor nitpicks, right? Because in all these cases, they actually prevent you from doing your work. They're not coding bugs, because we could all write a coherent specification for these, and I don't believe any of them have been reported as bugs. I would also argue they're not user interface flaws, because the user interface is perfectly clear, and it's faithful to the underlying function. The problem is that in all three cases, these systems just don't do what you want them to do. So that's what I'd like to investigate. So let's talk about what lies at the essence of an application. So if we look at applications, from mail applications, word processors, to Twitter and Photoshop and so on, if we had to explain, to a Martian who just came down to Earth, what does this thing do? How would you describe it? Well, I would explain these things in terms of the concepts. I would say that these applications are characterized by a few simple concepts. So if I wanted to explain an email client, I would really only have to explain the idea of an email address and a message, and maybe also folders, or in the case of Gmail, a label. If I want to explain Word, I'd probably need to explain text, but I'd need to explain paragraphs. In fact, it's sort of an amazing thing. Many people who use Word don't understand how fundamental the notion of a paragraph is. But if you don't understand the difference between a paragraph and a line break in Word, you can't really get Word to do anything you want. The notion of a style, which is really fundamental, and I'll come back to later. What about Twitter? Well, the idea of a tweet, the idea of a hashtag, which came in later, and the idea of following. And in the case of Photoshop, the idea of a pixel map, which is actually quite a subtle notion in Photoshop, and fundamentally the idea of a layer and a layer mask. It always amazes me that there are so many tutorials on Photoshop. When I was learning Photoshop, I had to buy this wonderful 500-page book by Scott Kelby that actually explains Photoshop in terms of the concepts, that actually says, here's what a layer mask is and how it works. Because until you get that, you really can't use Photoshop. And you can watch a million YouTube videos that tell you, here's how you get rid of red eye in Photoshop, and it will always seem like magic until you know what a layer mask is. Now, these concepts not only define these applications, but they also define classes of applications. So the difference between a text editor and a word processor and a desktop publishing app is in the concepts that they embody. So a text editor, as we know, is typically about lines and buffers, things like that. Word processors, on the other hand, have paragraphs and introduce notions of formatting and style. And desktop publishing apps, on top of the notion of style, will typically have the notion of a style sheet, so that collections of styles can be shared between people. And also this very subtle idea of text flow, the idea that you can basically place empty boxes on the page and indicate that those boxes are to be connected to one another so that when text is put in one, it will automatically flow through all of them. And that's how you do things like magazine layout. So it was very interesting to me when I was trying to figure out what Apple had done, as a lot of people were trying to figure out when they went from iWork 09 to the new version, what had happened to Pages. And here's a representative comment. This guy says, I just upgraded to the new Pages, and I can't find a way to link text boxes anymore. Am I missing something? Well, it turns out he's missing something big. What he's missing is that this concept, the concept of text flow, has been taken out of Pages because Apple has decided that Pages will no longer be a desktop publishing app. They've basically turned it into a word processor. Of course, they told the whole world, we're adding all these cool features. Pages has been upgraded. But what they were really doing was saying, we're going with the consumer market, and all you professionals who've been doing desktop publishing with Pages, right, move on. Go to Adobe InDesign, because we're not your thing anymore. And it was a very radical move, but it was a move that was signaled in this rather subtle change in the concepts. Now, we should also remember that although these concepts seem obvious to us, they often have a long history. So in the case of Word, for example, you might ask, where do words concepts come from? It turns out this is where they come from. They don't actually come from outer space, but here's Charles Simonyi. This is what happens when you do very well and invent very good concepts. You become wealthy enough to take rides on Russian spacecraft. And it was Charles Simonyi who brought the key concepts in Word to Microsoft from Xerox PARC. In fact, the way his team did it was they went to a printing company called Gin that was actually founded in the 19th century in Boston. And they went and they looked at the way they actually marked up text for printing. And they learned from them the notion of a style sheet. And they took that notion of styles and style sheets to the Bravo editor at Xerox. And from there, it made it into Word. And from there, into Apple Pages. And basically, to every single word processing and desktop publishing app in the world. There are different kinds of concepts. There are some concepts that are so old we don't even think of them as concepts, like the idea of a reservation. We're used to reserving all kinds of things, like reserving a dinner table, reserving a hotel room. But if you think about it, this is quite an intricate concept that we've had to learn, right, that has a kind of elaborate scenario involving multiple actions by multiple parties. And most concepts have that flavor. The notion of a social security number invented in 1936 in the American government, and so on. There are what I call instrumental concepts, which in an application aren't just used because they exist out there in the world, but are used because they're very important to the function of the app, like the notion of a hashtag in Twitter or a label in Gmail. And then there are what I call enabling concepts. And the enabling concepts are the ones that are so important, the app just couldn't exist without them. I mentioned layer masks in Photoshop, but think about relative references in a spreadsheet, right? If it were not for this incredibly clever and subtle concept of relative references, you wouldn't be able to copy a formula from one cell to another and have its meaning change the way it does, right? So you wouldn't be able to do that simple thing, when you're calculating a spreadsheet, to basically copy a formula into an entire column and have the column reflect the sum across all of the columns to the left. So it's important to remember all of these things were invented. Sometimes they're new, and sometimes they solve a hard design problem. So let me talk a little bit about, if concepts are going to be the center of our design work, how do we actually describe concepts? Let me first talk about how you would sketch a concept, because I think, and this is one of the things I'm sort of doing penance on as a formal methods person, I do think it's important to be able to sketch before you say something precisely. So how would you explain this? This is becoming an increasingly obscure item, and if you're born after about 1980, you probably don't know what this is. But this is a timer that can be plugged into an outlet to, for example, set a light to come on and off. And how would you explain how this works? Well, here's how I propose how you'd do it. Well, I should just point out, if you haven't seen exactly this kind of timer, it has these little tabs, and the tabs go in and out, okay? So the way I would explain it is like this, with what I call an it's not my term, an operational principle. And the operational principle is an archetypal scenario. It's just one scenario that explains exactly how and why this thing works. So, for example, for the timer, you might say, if you pull a tab out, right, then this thing rotates. When the time comes around for that tab, the light will go on, right? And notice this is a very incomplete description. It doesn't tell you, for example, what happens if you pull the tab out, the 12 o'clock tab out, when it is 12 o'clock. So it doesn't answer a lot of intricate questions about the behavior. But it tells you the fundamental causative relationship between what you can do as a user and what the outcome will be. And that's what you need to know to understand how to use this thing. And this idea of operational principles was invented by the chemist-philosopher Michael Polanyi. And he uses it as a way of really explaining the fundamental difference between science and engineering or technology. And what he says is, that you imagine, something like a clock. You could give a clock, to an ancient, scientist, or to any scientist who hadn't seen that particular clock. They couldn't explain how the clock works using the laws of physics, right? To understand how a clock works, you need to understand the roles that the parts of the clock play in fulfilling the function of a clock. The way I think about this is you imagine take a 19th century logician, take Charles Peirce, for example, and sit him down in front of Twitter, right? And say, well, you're a logician, this is logical, figure it out, right? Of course, he wouldn't be able to figure it out. And it wouldn't help if you showed him the code and just said, here's the denotational semantics of JavaScript or whatever, work it out. It all boils down to mathematics. That would not be very helpful, right? What you'd need to do is you'd need to explain what the concepts were and how you use them to fulfill a particular end goal. So this operational principle is a way we can describe all kinds of things. Here's the fundamental operational principle for styles. It's that if you change a style's format, all paragraphs of that style will change accordingly, right? That's the key operational principle. It's not all the other stuff about how you can use a predefined format and that kind of stuff. It's this fundamental principle that you can achieve consistency of styling in your document by having all the paragraphs of a given style, all the things labeled title or heading or whatever, change in concert. Sometimes the operational principle is obscure, and sometimes the designer doesn't quite want you to understand it. So in the case of tagging in Facebook, for example, if you tag a photo, all friends of the person tagged will be able to see the photo. Probably not something you expected. Selection. Why do we select things in an interface like the Finder? We select things so that if you select some files, and you press delete, for example, that delete operation will be aggregated over that entire collection, right? It's something we do so often, we forget that this was an invention, and it's a powerful one. I'll actually come back to that. So putting this together, the way I think about it is that the operational principle sits at the center of a sketch of what a concept is. It starts with its purpose and goes also to its misfits, the respects in which the concept does not fulfill its purpose. So let's take an example of this. Here's a concept, the concept of trash in the Macintosh Finder, right? Such a successful concept, that Microsoft and Apple fought over it, and Microsoft was not able to use the word trash. But it was a very clever invention. So what is the purpose of the trash? Well, one thing we have to remember is just because we rely on analogy, right, and Apple clearly pushed this, the idea of a trash can is something we're all familiar with, the purpose of the trash can in the Mac has no relationship whatsoever to the purpose of a regular trash can, right? The reason we have a regular trash can is something like to stage the removal of trash, right? Because we don't want to go outside and put it in the dumpster, right? The purpose of the trash in the Macintosh is to allow undo of deletions, right? And that's certainly not the case for most trash cans. Certainly, a few of us would want to undo the deletions in the trash cans in this hotel, right? So what's the operational principle? It's this. It's that if you delete a file, it gets moved to some special folder, and you can restore it from there. But emptying the trash removes the contents for good and makes space on the disk, right? So that's what you need to learn to understand how to use the trash. But the trash has many misfits. Here's two of them. The first, I don't know how many of you have noticed this, but if you put like a thumb drive into a Mac and you try and put a file on it and there's no space, it will say, delete some files. Well, if you delete the files, unfortunately, that won't work. The reason it won't work is because the space is not reclaimed until the trash is emptied. The problem is your files from your thumb drive will be moved into the general trash, and it won't be possible to empty that trash without deleting all the files that you've been saving from your hard drive, for example. So you'll lose the ability to restore any file if you empty the trash. So that's a big nuisance and a serious design failure. Here's another one. I don't know if you've noticed this one. If you delete an old file, it's late at night and you should be asleep, but you're just going through and deleting old stuff. You delete an old file, you delete another file, and then you say, oh, now I remember why I wanted that file, right? How do you undelete it? How do you get it back out of the trash? Well, unfortunately, you're really hosed. And the reason you're hosed is because if you're like me and you don't empty your trash until you need to, you have 100,000 items in your trash. Right? Well, you can't sort them by delete date. And so, basically, unless you remember the name of the file, there's no way to find it again. Now, actually, I should say, both of these misfits have been fixed in recent versions, in the last 1 or 2 versions of OS X. But they persisted for at least 20 years. OK, so that's about how to sort of sketch what a concept is. Let me talk about how to give some more detail if you actually want to model a concept, which is an important thing to be able to do. So let's take the example of word styles, where you can, for example, set up a style like heading and say I want all my headings to be in 14-point bold. So the first thing I do when I'm describing a concept is to construct a simple data model. You can think of this as a UML class diagram, although I prefer not to call these class diagrams because people then think they denote classes. And from my point of view, the entire value of data modeling is to avoid implementation biases and to postpone any decision about how you're actually going to represent the data in your program. So for that reason, I think ER diagrams are far superior to class diagrams. So this is basically like a little ER diagram. There's one or two useful features that I like to include, and one of them is you see this little crossbar here. That's an immutability marking, and it says that the property associated with a rule is fixed over the lifetime of the rule. And just being able to add these mutability notions turns out to be very useful. Now, the fundamental idea in how this particular concept works can be seen in this diagram. And it's that if you look at paragraphs here, paragraphs have rules, formatting rules, associated with them. And they can have them associated directly. You can actually select a paragraph and make it bold. But the style concept is indirect. So the paragraph first has a style, and then the style has the rules associated with it. And that is essentially the key idea in the concept of styles. And it's what makes styles work, right? Which is that you can have many paragraphs associated with a single style, and then by changing that one style, you change all the paragraphs implicitly. And it's an example of David Wheeler's observation that there is no problem in computer science that cannot be solved by introducing another level of indirection. Now, people actually often don't know that his quote actually had a second half, which was, and that always introduces new problems of its own. And in fact, there are many problems associated with styles, which I'm happy to discuss with you offline. So we have the data model. We have some operations, such as adding, deleting, and modifying styles, updating styles based on a particular paragraph, and applying styles, and so on. The next thing I do when I'm modeling concepts is to look at the relationship between concepts. And I define dependency in the following simple way. Some concept C depends on another concept C prime. If for every app A, if C is a concept of A, then C prime is also a concept of A. In other words, one concept depends on another if it can't exist without it. So let me show you an example of this. You can't have a notion of paragraphs without the concept of text. You can't have the notion of styles without the concept of formats and something like paragraphs to style. You can't have the concept of a style sheet if you don't have styles, right? So what this does is it basically defines a family of applications around this concept graph. And we can sort of place applications on this graph. So for example, something like Emacs has text, but none of the other concepts. Something like Apple Stickies has text, and it allows formatting, but it doesn't have paragraphs. TextEdit, on the other hand, like many basic text editors, has both formats and paragraphs. OpenOffice has styles, but it doesn't have style sheets. And Word has the whole lot. Okay? So we can understand a family and make decisions about which concepts we want to introduce into a family. And I have a little more to say about this later in terms of MVPs and agile design by looking at the structure of this dependence graph. Now, another very important thing to do whenever you're designing something is to be able to steal ideas, as Grady Booch said yesterday. So how do we reuse a concept? Well, let me give you an example of a reuse. So it turns out this notion of style appears absolutely everywhere. Once you start looking for it, it pops up in every corner. So in PowerPoint, for example, there's a notion of what's called, actually I wrote scheme there, but I think they might be called themes. Oh no, they are called schemes, color schemes. And a color scheme is essentially a kind of a style concept, because you can say, for example, I want my titles to be bold, and I don't use PowerPoint, so I don't remember what they're called, but there's like primary text and secondary text and whatever, and you can assign different styles to these things, different formats to these things, and that allows you to format the slide presentation consistently. Here's another example. In Adobe InDesign, it has this swatch palette. And when you first use this, you don't actually realize that there's a concept of styles here, because you see you're being invited to just select a swatch and apply that swatch to color an object. And you can create your own swatches. But what you'll discover is, if you go back to one of these swatches and you modify its color, everything that was previously colored with that swatch will have its color updated. Okay? So this is actually a style mechanism. Sometimes things look like styles but aren't styles. Apple's color picker, for example, looks very like the swatches in InDesign, but it's not a style mechanism. Here's a screenshot from Write2, which is one of many text editors that pretend to have styles. They give you things that are even sometimes called styles, but they're not styles. The reason in these two cases, in the case of the Apple Color Picker, is that the swatch color mapping is fixed. So you'll find that if you go to one of those swatches, you can't change it. You can only delete and add new swatches. And in the case of the text editor, there's no mapping between elements and styles. It doesn't remember that a paragraph had a particular style. So you can apply it, but you can't update it. So we can build a data model for a generic notion of style. And we can specify different add-ons and different variants. And then in the, following the kind of example of the design patterns, we can list, in addition to the features we've talked about, we can list other features of the concept, such as which other concepts it's related to, and what particular issues arise in the use and the design of that particular concept. So if you're going to use that concept, you can be aware of the kind of problems that come up. Now, one of the things I've found really fun trying to identify these concepts is that some of the most simple concepts that we use every day turn out to be really subtle. So let me give you an example of that. Here's a concept I call selection. And you might think this is ridiculous, but it's actually kind of fun. So in this tool I'm using now, for example, I can have a view in which I see thumbnails of the slides, and I can select multiple slides. And then, for example, if I press the delete button, all the ones that are selected will be deleted. Similarly, in Adobe Lightroom, I have thumbnails of my photographs, and I can do the same thing. I can apply lightening operations and other kinds of things to all the photos that are selected. In Apple Mail, most mail clients, you can select a subset of messages and do things to them. In Evernote, you can select the notes. In Preview, you can actually manipulate the pages by selecting thumbnails. And in the OS X Finder, you can select files and folders and so on. Now, you might think, well, this is completely trivial, but it turns out to be really interesting. Let me just point out a couple of subtleties. The first is that there's a notion of selection scope. So in the Finder, for example, you can select files in different open windows. And then you might wonder, well, what happens if I now execute delete on this selection? Well, it turns out it will only delete the files or folders that have been selected in the active window. So there's an additional subtlety here that's implemented that will maintain a memory of the entire selection, but the actual application of the operation is only to the subset of the selected objects that are in scope. Here's another thing. This is very common. This is actually from Lightroom. It's probably hard for you to see on this screen, but in many applications, not all operations can be applied to a set. Some can only be applied to one object. And so the solution to that is normally to identify one element of the selection as a special active element, and that's indeed what Lightroom does. So if I do an operation such as go to next photo, right, it will apply that to the active element and not to the entire selection. Here's another example. Sometimes the selection isn't actually a Boolean. Sometimes it's continuous. In Photoshop, you can do things called marching ants. I'm not sure you can see them here, but you can basically move your cursor, your mouse around, and you can select some pixels in the image. But if you look carefully at this, you'll see that the edge is not sharp. The edge is what's called feathered, and that's a powerful feature of Photoshop. The idea is that in the middle here, these elements are selected, are completely selected, 100% selected. These elements out here are not selected at all, and between the two, there's a gradient of partial selection. And the way this is used is that when you apply a function, for example, darkening or lightening or deleting or whatever, those functions will be applied, attenuated by the amount of the selection. And this is an incredibly powerful and useful feature. Another final example, what does it mean to select a folder? It can mean very different things. So for example, in Google Drive, when you select a folder, it's equivalent to selecting its children. But in CrashPlan, when you select a folder, what you're saying is, I want to back up this folder, which means that if you ever put another file or folder into this folder, I want that to be backed up too. So this is actually a very subtle distinction where the selection of the folder means completely different things. And we can build models that explain all this with different variants to explain these different features. So I have a catalog of these concepts that I've been building. OK, let's talk about evaluation. So we've seen how you can sketch a concept and how you can define a concept more precisely. Now you're looking at a concept, maybe you just sketched it, and you're trying to understand whether or not this concept will actually be fit for purpose. How do you do that? So I've been working on this for a long time, and I have to say I don't believe that I've solved this problem, but I've made a little bit of progress. And the progress is kind of surprising because it's an observation that is so simple and so extreme that I suspect your reaction will be that it's ridiculous. But let me try and convince you that it makes some sense anyway. The fundamental principle that I've come up with again and again is that in a well-designed system, each concept should be motivated by one purpose. And I don't mean at least one purpose. I mean at most one purpose. So the ideal mapping is that you can identify exactly one purpose for each concept, and there's a bijection. And that means there are basically 4 things that can go wrong. You have a purpose that has no concept. Well, that's pretty obvious, right? You have, and I call that an unfulfilled purpose. You have a concept that's unmotivated. It's there in the system. It's cluttering up the design, but it has no purpose. You have, in the bottom right, a redundant concept, meaning that you have 2 concepts that are attempting to fulfill the same purpose. And then the most controversial one, in the top right, you have what I call an overloaded concept, which means that you have a concept that's attempting to fulfill 2 different purposes. So let me give you some examples of these. Let's start with unfulfilled purposes. So this P2 is unfulfilled because it has no concept associated with it. And that means there's a kind of ghost concept, C2, that we wish were there to fulfill that function. So what we saw in the Adobe InDesign example was exactly such an unfulfilled purpose, right? We knew what we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to do uniform italicization of different typefaces. That's a very straightforward purpose, but it's a purpose for which no concept exists. So the purpose is to allow typeface-independent styling, and we need some concept like a subfamily. And in fact, that concept does exist, and in fact, it has existed in applications. So in Keynote 09, for example, there is a notion of subfamily. So if you look carefully, I'm not sure you can read this, but if you look carefully at this, you'll see that the font here is Magma Light, not Magma. And there are toggles here to turn bold and italic on and off. This solves the problem. And it solves the problem because Apple have recognized there's not only Magma, which is the family of typefaces that goes by that name, but there's Magma Light, which is a subfamily, the light version. Unfortunately, for reasons I don't quite understand, maybe it was part of Apple's move towards a consumer market, they removed this. So in Keynote 6, we're back again with the font being Magma, and again it won't work. Now, there are many of these unfulfilled purposes if you look around. The one that's most, I think most egregious to me, and exists for, I think, reasons that are quite hard to fix, is that we don't actually have a concept of user in email. We have it to some extent. Within a closed system like Gmail, we have it, but beyond that, we don't have it. And this results in all the confusions we have about lack of authentication, about the fact that it's impossible to search. At least in Apple Mail, it's impossible to search for an email from a particular person if that person happens to use different email addresses and so on. There are a bunch of other examples. I think I'm going to, well, maybe I'll mention 1 or 2 of them. Here's an interesting one, actually. So it turns out that Lightroom, the designers of Lightroom, which is a spectacularly successful photo organization program, decided to simplify the import mechanism. Meaning when you read photos into the catalog, they decided that it was too complicated and they would make it easier for their users. And there was such an outcry, they actually published an apology and within weeks reverted to the old version. I don't know when that's happened in a major software release by a company like Adobe before, but it was a really major about-face, and I think it was a very brave move of theirs. One of the interesting things was that the users complained about various features that Adobe eliminated that Adobe had presumably thought were unimportant. And it's quite interesting to think about how concepts that you might think are unimportant actually turn out to be crucially important for some users. And an example of that interests me is that they had a feature called eject after import. And what that meant was that you could check a box that said, when you've imported the files from this particular flash card, eject it. And I can well imagine the discussion at Adobe. Someone said, this is really stupid, right? Everybody knows how to eject a mounted disk, right? Why are we cluttering up our interface to replicate a trivial little bit of functionality that's already there in the operating system, right? But it actually turned out that users really valued this. And the reason they valued this is that they are most photographers are totally paranoid about corrupting their data, right? So they want that flash card to be unmounted as soon as possible. They don't want to wait. They don't want any accidents. And so they really valued the feature that says, as soon as you've got the last photo off that flash card, unmount it. And Adobe put that back. So it's quite interesting there, I would say. There was a misunderstanding about what the purpose of this concept was. Adobe perhaps thought the purpose was convenience, but the purpose was not convenience. The purpose was actually safety. Unmotivated concepts. These are harder to find. Concepts that exist in applications that apparently have no purpose. Facebook had this thing called pokes, and no one was really sure what pokes were for. And pokes seem to have died. But there are more common cases of unmotivated concepts, and here are some of them. Here's a controversial one, and I'm still not sure if this has a purpose. But remember there used to be this thing called buffers? Like when you opened a text editor, you got a buffer. I guess some of you, probably still use these things. I'm teasing, sorry. This idea, Apple basically decided that this is, a 20th century idea and we don't need it anymore. And I suspect they're right? Because the idea of a buffer was presumably because you couldn't afford to write back to disk all the time. Well, now you can write everything back to disk. So there doesn't seem to be any reason to have buffers. And for that reason, Apple redesigned the file menu to get rid of all those buffer operations like save and save as and so on, causing much cognitive confusion to those of us who grew up in the 20th century and have sort of, melded our minds to that particular concept. Often, concepts are there because the designers basically had to work around some problem in the design. So I believe that Git is full of these things. So the whole notion of stashing in Git. In fact, one of the reasons I believe Git is so hard to learn is that most of the concepts have no purpose. The purpose is normally to fix some other problem. And until you understand why Git fails to do X, you won't understand why you need Y. And stashing is like that. The reason you need stashing is because branching doesn't work. And I'll mention more about that later. We do these things to programming languages. Clue, this beautiful object-oriented language designed in 1977 by my colleague Barbara Liskov, it's actually one of the first object-oriented languages I used, had this nice observation that a language could manipulate objects and that integers and strings and any kind of thing could be treated as an object. And this was all sorted out, and she figured out how to implement this efficiently. And then Java comes along, and Java says, oh, no, we've got to look like C++. So we'd better have primitives and objects. And ever since then, first of all, there was the generation who was scratching their head saying, what the heck's the difference between a primitive and an object, right? And then they introduced boxing. It's like, whoa, what the heck is boxing? Well, boxing, doesn't have any purpose. That's why it's so hard to understand. Its purpose is just to make up for the mess that was created before. And I believe the same thing is true in JavaScript. What is null for? Whenever I try and explain this to my students, I have to go back to my notes. What is null? I don't know what null is. It's somehow different from undefined, but in ways that most mere mortals don't understand, because it has no purpose. Okay, so it's easy to make fun, I know, and I should resist it, because sometimes these things do arise for good engineering reasons. Okay. Redundant concepts. So this is the case where you have multiple concepts attempting to fulfill a single purpose. So I would argue that that was the problem with categories in Gmail, right? Gmail already had smart labels. And if the Google team had managed to extend the functionality of smart labels to encompass this nice new organization of the inbox, both the customization feature and the new kinds of filters, I think everybody would have been happy with it. But it was the fact that they introduced a new concept that seemed to basically have the same purpose, namely to classify messages, that everybody was confused. Another example of this, I've done a little study of Acrobat, and I don't know how many of you have used Acrobat 9, but it was a famously unpopular program, and amazingly complicated. And one of the reasons was it had so many concepts. Even in Acrobat 10, where they did a major cleanup of the user interface, unfortunately, they kept all the confusing concepts. So you probably can't see this, but if you look at this, look carefully here, you'll see there are 3 different concepts for dealing with text in this version of Acrobat. One is called document text, one is called objects, and one is called text boxes. And if you didn't know which of the 3 you were dealing with, things got very tricky. And of course, this makes no sense at all, because text is text is text, and it shouldn't matter whether the text is something you added or something that was in the original document and so on. And so mercifully, in Acrobat 11, they got rid of that. And there is now just one concept called text, and that makes everyone much happier. OK, on to the controversial one. So because I know you're going to beat me up on this, I'm going to defer to higher authority. So Matthew in the New Testament says, it's actually not my personal higher authority, but in this case, any higher authority will do. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And my contention is, this is what happens when you try and fulfill two purposes with one concept. You can try as hard as you like, but you'll always disappoint one of them. And so I would like to identify three forms of overloading. What I call piggybacking, which means that you had this old concept, and you wanted to squeeze in some functionality, and you thought, oh, it's so painful, we can't really afford to do that properly. We'll just piggyback it on there. Nobody will notice, will they? That will work nicely. And then sadly, they do notice. False convergence means optimistically, you look at the beginning and you say, you know what? We can do two things with that one concept. Wow, isn't that cool? But you turn out to be wrong. And the third is what I call an emergent purpose, which is where you didn't recognize that actually a concept was so cool it would end up being used for multiple purposes, but that those purposes wouldn't quite align. So I would claim that the problem that I illustrated with my Fuji camera is an example of piggybacking. And if you look carefully at this menu, what you will see is that in this, and the name gives it away, in this image size menu, right, what they've done is they've piggybacked the aspect ratio on the JPEG dimensions, right? Notice that they have large, medium, and small. This is a menu to choose how big the JPEG is going to be, right? And some bright engineer said, you know, we're just sizing the image. Let's put aspect ratio in there. But of course, that then created the problem that this was about JPEGs. And now, if you don't have JPEG set, how are you going to make sense of the aspect ratio? Here's an even worse one. For my Epson printer, there is a dialog box that has a paper size option. In this case, this is piggybacking on top of Apple's driver. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the paper size I have selected is US letter. Well, here's another quiz question. What happens if I click on that? What other options do I have? Well, you'll never guess, but I have options like this. US letter manual front, US letter manual roll, US letter sheet feeder. Right? So what's going on here is that there's a completely different purpose, right? And that purpose is to choose the source of the paper, where the paper comes from, not just its size. And someone at Epson had the really brilliant idea that that could be merged into this concept of the paper size. And needless to say, that is a catastrophe. It means, first of all, there are all kinds of weird invariants. Like, for example, you can't create custom sizes for sheets that you're front-loading. But it also does weird things because other applications use the paper size. So, for example, Lightroom has a nice notion of page size presets, where you can say, this is how I like to lay out a greeting card, for example. I put the image up here, and I have this margin, and so on. And now that preset will only work for front-loaded paper and not for back-loaded paper, because it has to be bound to a page size, and a page size for an Epson printer includes this other feature. False convergence is when two purposes look the same. This is one that just came up in my administrative work, and we're all very familiar with this when we do performance reviews, right? Our performance review form looks like this, and it says we're trying to do two things. We're trying to evaluate how much salary increase the person should get, and we're trying to give really useful, constructive feedback. Right? We do the same things with conferences. We write a review and say, this review has two purposes: to give you really helpful feedback on your paper, and to tell you that we hate you and don't want to publish it. Right? These two are clearly not compatible. Right? You cannot fulfill both things with the same concept, and yet we persist in doing that. Here's another example of false convergence of a slightly different and more questionable sort. In something like Facebook or Twitter, if you think about the purpose of friends, right, there are really two different purposes. One is to filter incoming posts. I'd like to only see, I don't want to see posts from the whole world. And the other is to control access to my posts, right? And these are really two different purposes. Now, I think in this case, it was quite wise to align the purposes because it reduces the complexity. But it's not surprising, perhaps, that Facebook later basically added following in addition to friending to cover the other purpose. Now, emergent purposes are when users find a second purpose. So here's one of my favorite examples of that. Consider the concept of the subject of an email message, right? So its original purpose was to summarize content. Right? You could look at the subject, and you knew roughly what the thing was going to be about, whether you had to deal with it now or later. Unfortunately, because this subject header didn't have any constraints on it, people started using it for all kinds of other purposes, sometimes to good effect, but sometimes to disastrous effect. So here's an example. People start using the subject field to mark who the sender of the message is. So, for example, our lab listserv, CCell related, helpfully puts the name of the listserv in the subject field, right? So that you know that this is, in case you didn't want to read the to field, you knew that this was from that particular listserv, right? And Shriram Krishnamurti pointed out to me that he noticed a case in which this actually had a disastrous consequence. A faculty colleague of his sent a message that he thought was sending to a bunch of people, and he thought he was BCCing. He was BCCing. The problem was he BCC'd a listserv. And the listserv then, of course, announced what that listserv that was being BCC'd was in the subject field, violating the very purpose of the BCC. Here's another example of an emergent purpose, grouping by conversation, right? Because we don't have a concept of conversation in email clients, every email client out there is desperately trying to find a way to hack onto existing concepts the notion of a conversation. And of course, it doesn't work. My student, Insuk Kang, pointed out to me that when he makes trip reservations, he likes to use different labels in Gmail for different trips. SATURN 16, ICSI, whatever, right? But unfortunately, some of the companies he deals with, such as Expedia, always use the same subject header, your upcoming trip. And because Gmail requires that messages in the same conversation have the same labels, or when they get assigned labels coming in, what happens is all his trips get merged together. OK, so that's a quick overview of different ways of analyzing concepts. I want to say a little bit about a case study that we've been doing. We've actually spent a lot of time analyzing all these small things, looking at many different applications and systems, and I've had a series of wonderful students who, as undergraduate or master's projects, have done this kind of analysis. A more sustained study we've done, though, is of Gitless, of Git rather, and we've come up with a tool we call Gitless, which is supposed to be Git less the pain. Actually, long after we came up with Gitless and have been dueling with the Git community who insist that Git is absolutely perfect, there was this wonderful XKCD comic that actually summarizes the exact operational principle of Git. And in short, it's that if you risk getting stuck, basically just delete everything and clone again. And the reason that people do this is because they don't know how to get out of those holes, and they don't have time in their life. They could, of course, read a 1,000-page book about version control, but surprisingly, some people think that's not worth their time. So my student Santiago has implemented this Gitless tool, which you can find online. And the idea behind Gitless is basically to rework some of the fundamental concepts of Git. Git, of course, is a very powerful system with a very powerful API. So this is really just a veneer on top of Git. And it basically presents some different concepts, but uses all the great stuff in Git underneath. So I'll just give you one example of that. The concept of a branch. The purpose, we believe, of the concept of a branch in Git is to support an independent line of development. And the operational principle is something like this. It's that when you switch branches, your working directory gets synchronized with the new branch, and you can make and commit changes that will then be invisible on other branches. And when you're done, you can merge the branch back into the master branch, or whatever branch it is. The problem is that there are many misfits to this particular concept. In particular, you can't switch branches if you have uncommitted changes. So you have to start doing things like stashing. And then you can't quite do that if you have the wrong kinds of conflicts, and it's all a bit of a disaster. So the fix that Santiago came up with is basically to subtly change the concept of a branch. So a branch is associated not only with a branch in the repository, but also with its own working directory. So when you switch branches, the old working directory disappears, and the new working directory is there. Basically using features like stashing under the covers as things that the user does not need to know about any longer to achieve similar effect. We did a user study where we basically took a dozen Git experts and we gave them a series of tasks to do with Git and then with Gitless after they had 15 or 20-minute introduction to Gitless. And we videoed them, we measured the amount of time they took, and so on. And we got some fairly interesting results, which suggest that Gitless is quite promising. And in particular, on difficult tasks, the variance of times that people take is much, much smaller. OK, so to conclude, I opened by saying that I was looking for what the elements of software design would be, the aspect of software design in which we're concerned with the relationship between the system and its users. And I argued that those elements should be concepts and the purposes that they fulfill. And then I talked about the criteria and told you my initial idea on that, this very simple idea that concepts and purposes should be in one-to-one relationship to one another. To put this into a little bit of context, when I think about the history of software development, it can be summarized, I think, by these three little pictures. We used to do software development like this. This is the waterfall scheme, right? We started with a bunch of requirements, then we did some design implementation. The requirements would be started by the client, then we might talk to the client, and then we finished the requirements off ourselves, and eventually we threw it back and the client tested it. Then we decided that was a terrible idea, so we should do agile, so we get rid of requirements and we get rid of design, and instead we just implement stuff, and then the client tests it. Yeah, it's a little unfair. And now, of course, everyone's talking about design thinking. And design thinking is cool, so we can put requirements back, but we call requirements need finding, because that's much cooler. And actually, what's interesting here is now that the requirements sit between the client and the implementers. The requirements are now done collaboratively. But the very attractive aspect of design thinking is that we've retained the iterative model from Agile, which is that the design and implementation are done in phases. So I do think that Agile and design thinking do represent real advances when used appropriately over the waterfall model, but they raise some fundamental questions. So one question is, when you do an Agile system, how do you choose this increment? When you do a little piece of an MVP, or you say, I'm going to implement a thing, right? What are you going to implement? And one of the things that Bertrand Meyer points out in his wonderful little book about agile development and its advantages and flaws is that it can be quite catastrophic if you choose the wrong increment, because you can then find later, when you try and extend it, that you hadn't essentially had a sufficient scope for that first increment, and then when you try and extend it, it's not extendable. And there's no amount of refactoring that's going to save you. You basically needed to think harder and larger before you did that piece of development. And in the case of design thinking, again, the process is very clear, but what actually goes in the boxes isn't so clear. What do you actually do in this design box? So we have a bunch of generic things, such as brainstorming and user studies and so on, but can we go beyond that? And really, what I'm trying to do, and what I present you today with, is really the beginnings of an attempt to develop some answers to these questions. And this is basically the picture that I have so far, that at the center we have concepts that fulfill purposes. These concepts can be evaluated with criteria and suggested by patterns and organized into a dependent structure. And it's the purposes that we want to fulfill and the dependencies between the concepts that can give us some help in determining which increments, what the increments will be in an agile development. So that's all I have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel. We have time for a couple of questions. We have 2 mics in here, so if you can come to the mic and ask questions. So we'll take a couple of questions. We'll start here.
Is this division between waterfall, agile, and design thinking a generational thing? Do we think that waterfall is the way that people in their 50s and 60s do things, that agile is the way that the generation in the 30s do things, and that design thinking is going to be the cool, everybody works in offices like they see on CSI and television with the low light coming up from below them, and they're in their 20s and all good looking?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It could be that this is a generational thing. It could also be it's a cultural thing. Design thinking people like people more than most software developers do. So, you know, so and I'm not telling you which category I'm in. You know, I guess I aspire to be, you know, to like people, but I think that's definitely a difference. You know, a lot of agile developers, I think, probably would rather be, you know, spending their lives with Git and Emacs than you know, with their customers. I think so. I think there are also cultural things there. I think obviously there are also you know, important domain questions. You know, I think design thinking is undoubtedly more suitable for a domain in which there's a lot of uncertainty. What, you know, the design people call wicked problems. A lot of uncertainty about what the problem is to be solved. And as Grady Booch was saying yesterday, I think, you know, there are obvious limitations to Agile where, you know, something, certainly more documentation up front for something that's critical can be advised. So I think there are many different factors that determine the relationship between these camps.
Good answer.
We have Len over there.
Yeah, first, thank you. I enjoyed this. How many you started this. How many concepts do you think are there? And how quickly will they grow once you've exhausted looking at existing systems?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. How many concepts are there? Well, I actually have a feeling that, you know, that there aren't that many. And in fact, you know, when I look, for example, at, you know, social media apps, right, you find that basically there's quite a small family of concepts that all the apps use together. And, you know, people often agonize over the question, why is it that, that teenagers seem to be so much better at using apps than oldies like us? Well, I don't think it's because somehow their brains are more computational. I think it's that they have simply absorbed a collection of concepts very deeply, right? So the reason that a teenager, when they open WhatsApp and haven't seen it before, or Snapchat or whatever, and immediately knows what to do, is not just because they understand that look and feel. It's because they already know what following and friending and, you know, and groups are, and they already know what a message is, and they already know what a hashtag is, and they already know what upvoting means, right? So they understand all these concepts. And I think that's one reason that it's so easy for people to move between these applications. We're actually doing a project. My student Santiago and I are working on something we call Deja Vu, which is a system that we hope will allow you to assemble applications from what we call conceptual cliches. So, for example, maybe you want to build a new kind of social media app, right? And you know you want to have friend relations, and you want to have posts, maybe of a different type, and you want to have commenting on the posts. So maybe you want commenting on the commenting, and maybe commenting on the commenting on the commenting, right? Well, you shouldn't need to build this all afresh, right? Because we only need to look to Stack Overflow to know what a comment is, or to know what an upvote is, right? We only need to look to Facebook to see what friending means. So you should be able to take these sort of polymorphic concepts and basically assemble them all together. So I think there are relatively few of them, but I think we will continue to see really imaginative new concepts emerge as there are new applications. So for example, in IoT, I suspect one of the things we're going to need are some fundamental new concepts in order to structure that domain.
Thank you. Rick?
Hi, thanks for the thought-provoking talk. So the notion that there's a one-to-one relationship between purposes and concepts seems to ignore economic considerations. So if I want to haul my family around, I might want a minivan, and if I want to go fast, I might want a sports car, and I can't afford two, so I buy a sports luxury sedan or something like that. And we do the same thing with software products all the time. So how do you address that trade-off?
That's an excellent question. I, in fact, planted this question. So there... It's a great question, right? And it's something I've worried about. So I hoped I could fool you all. Nobody would ask this question, but I was ready for it in case you did. So of course, sharing is often thought to be the essence of good design. You know, here's an example from actually an old PhD thesis, which I really love, what a nail clipper looks like, and what it would actually look like if the functions were separated into separate components. So, you know, so clearly there is an there's an engineering efficiency to be obtained by having the same concept serve multiple purposes. And that will sometimes be necessary. What I like to think is that it will be successful when you can find an abstract purpose that actually makes sense. If it's a kind of coincidental sharing, like the examples I showed you, then you'll be in trouble. But sometimes you'll be able to find an abstract purpose. So some examples of that. In Amazon has both wish lists and shopping lists. And you can see that they have very different functions. Wish lists are to get my friends to buy me gifts, right? And shopping lists are for me to buy gifts for my own friends, right? But they do have a shared abstract purpose, which is basically to indicate that I want to save stuff, right? And that can be represented like that. Another example, Doodle. In Doodle polls, there are two different purposes. Maybe I want to schedule a meeting. Maybe I want to choose a favorite chocolate with some friends for a chocolate eating ceremony, right? And Doodle will let me do this because it has basically a concept of just selecting things that aren't times. Photoshop has this notion of grayscale image. I don't have time to explain this, but grab me afterwards if you want to hear about it, which is an incredibly powerful concept that serves multiple purposes. And there are many of these. But they have risks. I would just point out that, let me just point out one of them, that you normally limit the functionality. So for example, in the case of Doodle, the fact that they haven't burnt into the application the notion of times, right, and that they allow you to select arbitrary things as a kind of shared concept means that they can't provide quite as nice an interface as, for example, When to Meet provides, that focuses only on scheduling. But you're exactly right. There's a trade-off here, and it's one that I'm thinking about.
Can I take a question from there?
Have you taken this process one step further by moving the requirement next to a design, because sometimes that the requirement is not available upfront?
I'm sorry, the requirement is not?
It's not available upfront because you cannot collect all the requirement in the front.
If I understand the question correctly, the question is how do you go about the design when the requirements are not fully known? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, I think that's an interesting problem, and I think actually that's something that the design thinking field has been thinking about. I think it's also actually inherent in the idea of agile, which is a kind of solution-focused approach to construction, where you can't fully explore your requirements until you've built something and got a sense of how well it works. And I think that is inevitable for many applications. I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't very, very carefully decide what concepts we want to embed in the first version in order to get the most from that experiment. But I think it is something that we'll inevitably need to do.
Okay, we'd
Yes.
like to finish at 10:05, so we'll take Eljo, Michael, and then.
Okay, before we do that, I'm going to, if I don't remember, I'm going to forget. I want to take a photograph to remember this exciting moment in my life.
We'll
So I'm going to do this.
Daniel?
So you can. So I'm going to. This is very exciting. I'm going to try and do a. Oh, it tells me I have to go that way. I'm trying to do a panorama. So you have to look happy. Oh my goodness, it worked. Thank
All right,
you.
so
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a software architecture conference, and I think you mentioned the word architect once. There was an interesting table with about designers versus engineers, and so where does the architect fit in there? Just to give you a heads up, people here tend to think that architects have either something to do with fulfilling quality attributes or with fulfilling making decisions that address the most risky issues in the solution. And the two usually tend to be the same.
So I think, so that's a great question. And the truth is I didn't really discuss software architecture because I don't really have a good answer to your question. I do think that, first of all, I think there are areas of commonality between what I call designing and engineering. And George Fairbanks' talk yesterday focused on this idea of models as kind of central to both. I think that a very interesting question is what is the impact of concepts on the underlying software architecture? And I think that if the software architecture doesn't somehow reflect the most fundamental concepts, then you will be in an unhappy situation. So I think that the architecture is influenced by the choice of concepts. That said, I think there are some aspects of an architecture which are there purely for the purpose of performance, for example. If you're doing load balancing in the cloud, right, you're probably not going to be doing things that are that constrained by the concepts that are presented to a typical end user. But the relationship is something to be explored and is an interesting one.
We go over there.
Sorry to be so evasive.
Hey, Dr. Jackson, thanks a lot for a great show. I'm Charles Chow from Deloitte Consulting. The question I have is regarding the new method of merge and branching. And as far as you know, we are dealing with this kind of problem on a daily basis. It's really a simple but complex problem. Can you elaborate, like from your new approach, how the developer's local copy can still be synchronized?
How the developer's local copy remains synchronized. So actually, we store the working directory. Both the old working directory and the new working directory are saved. So it's as if you did stashing, but you don't have to do it yourself. So the working directory appears to change, and the old working directory appears to have disappeared. But when you switch branches back, you get the old working directory in exactly the state it was before. So it's simply, the system simply implements the storing of the old working directory for you. So I think it's actually probably fairly close to the way that most Git developers actually work using stashing. But it means that they don't need to actually understand the concept of stashing, and simplifies the concept of branching for them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Michael? We're good. Go ahead. This is the last question.
Based on what you've seen and kind of your own thoughts on this, who within an organization or who on a team is responsible for creating these concepts, maintaining them, things like that? And I guess a follow-up that I kind of have is, like, can you recommend a pattern catalog? You kind of hinted that there might be a finite number of concepts, right?
Right. So there are two questions there. So the second one is easy to answer, which is I'm building such a pattern catalog. I don't know of any that exist, and would love to have people's help and involvement in doing that. Actually, I shouldn't say I don't know any that exist. One thing I've noticed that there are organizations that are building quite impressive catalogs that are very similar to concept catalogs. And one of them is that in Britain, the government has done a lot of impressive work on simplifying the services that they provide to citizens. And they've done a lot of quite cutting-edge work on separating out services in a sort of microservice style almost. And they actually publish a catalog of fundamental concepts to do with things like renewing your driving license and so on, and the relationships between them. So I think in some domains you're seeing that. The answer to your first question is, who in an organization should do this? And I should really, I think I have to declare ignorance on that. I'm not, I'm never someone who's worked for, I've only worked for a few years in a company. It was a long time ago. I don't really have good knowledge of how companies are organized. I will say that my impression is that, that this will need to be something that will change culturally. Mitch Kapor, a long time ago, made the case for software designers as central people in an organization. What he meant by that term was both what I meant and someone who was essentially a chief architect. And although we have people who are called chief architects, I think we still haven't completely committed to the idea of people who have that role. I heard someone from IBM talk about a new design thinking effort there, where they're trying to insinuate design thinking into the company. And it's really requiring a cultural revolution. So I think that we're going to need to see some very dramatic changes in the way companies think about what's being done in order to raise the prominence of design and architecting to actually be given roles that stand out. And that's going to take some time.
Thanks.
Okay, so to conclude, SATURN would like to present you with a token of appreciation for being with us, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
This
Beautiful.
small gift.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
your
much.
time here. And we're going to break.
So
Thanks so much.